It's been great being here at the Volpe Center. I have driven by here many times, never had any idea what actually happened. I've become much more aware more recently before coming today, and I just want to thank you for everything that you do here, the work that gets done, particularly as we think about the future of transportation beyond traffic. I think is really quite path-breaking, many other. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And Ellen, thank you so much. So in any event, as Ellen said, I was deputy mayor of New York at a very formative period, started right after 9/11. And you may remember that when I was deputy mayor of New York in the Bloomberg administration, we put out a plan for congestion pricing. Does anybody remember that? Now, I'm sure many of you actually remember that it was a huge success. The parking industry welcomed us with open arms. Constituents and local politicians sent us flowers and thank you cards. We solved traffic congestion and generated money for transit, and no one in Manhattan ever honked or cursed again. Actually, excuse me one second. Oh, no, it says according to Twitter, I may be misremembering some of the details. The truth is, as fellow policymakers and analysts of policy, you all understand that there are some really great ideas out there about how to improve transportation in cities. You also know that it is really, really hard to get them implemented within the institutional barriers to the political realities facing local government. Look, cities are complex places. They're stymied by funding challenges and political obstacles. NIMBYism is everywhere. They're slowed down by outdated regulations and excess bureaucracy. Right now in New York, we are Sidewalk Labs is replacing the payphones with these incredible Wi-Fi hotspots that are really data and communication hubs. The amount of paperwork just to pull out a payphone. Who uses a payphone? To pull out a payphone would make your head explode. Now, the reality is that some of this incrementalism is vital, right? It protects the public interest and makes sure that community voices are heard. But of course, too much incrementalism can lead to stagnation. As Secretary Fox has pointed out, the biggest transportation advance in the past decade, probably more than the past decade, may in fact be the smartphone, with its ability to connect people to new mobility services and real-time travel information. Now that advance came from the tech industry, not from transportation leaders. Tech companies do this kind of thing very well. They retrace problems back to first principles, challenging conventional assumptions about how things work, and the result is they are often able to leapfrog small change. What they don't do well is deal with the externalities. And that's what the urbanist, and especially municipal government, but at all levels of government, has to do. As President Obama recently pointed out, government is there to deal with the problems that no one else wants to deal with. And that includes issues like Title VI and serving people without smartphones and dealing with the unemployment issues that arise from the gig economy placing all kinds of different workers. Now, I've been at both ends of this urbanist technologist divide, going from City Hall to Bloomberg L.P. to Sidewalk Labs. We are a Google or Alphabet company. I started Sidewalk Labs just a little more than a year ago in partnership with Google or now Alphabet, to develop new technologies that address fundamental urban problems. Our mission, as we see it, is to bridge that divide between the urbanist and technologist so that new technologies can transform cities in positive ways. As urbanists, we must keep making the day-to-day improvements in the services we manage for all residents. But we also need to push ourselves to think bigger about the future of cities and how to prepare for them. As technologists, we need to keep questioning what's possible, but we also need to recognize the enormous role that policy plays in shaping the social impact of new innovations. When you bring these two sides together, then the physical environment can truly converge with the digital age. And I am an optimist. I'm the guy who tried to bring congestion pricing to New York. And by the way, someday it will come to New York. So I believe that there is a much brighter future in store for our cities. Now, we've seen this throughout history. The biggest revolutions in our urban environments over the last 200 years have all occurred at the intersection of technology and city life. For better or worse, the steam engine, the electric grid, and the automobile. Now I believe we are on the verge of what I like to call the fourth technological revolution in cities. Today I'm going to describe a few things Sidewalk is doing to bring that future forward and what policymakers can do to help. Now, over the past year or so, our team of urbanists and technologists have engaged in a massive thought experiment designed to reimagine cities from what I like to say, the internet up. What I mean by that is imagine a place where ubiquitous connectivity is built into the very foundation of the city, and where the data that produces is harnessed to improve urban life. A connected city can ingest loads of real-time data from the environment, everything from road quality to cycling patterns to emissions. And it turns the city into a platform, giving everyone the ability to swap in new innovations that can be tested and refined quickly. That's the important part, because it means you actually have a chance to accelerate the incremental rate of change that typically constrains cities. As part of this thought experiment, we convened hundreds of the world's leading experts across mobility, infrastructure, the built environment, governance, and even social policy, literally all areas of urban life. We focused on the fundamental problems overlooked by the tech world. And of course, many of those pain points centered on transportation. All of you know these trends, but they bear repeating. Cities across the United States face growing congestion. 100-year-old infrastructure is crumbling. Convenient and affordable access to jobs are out of reach for far too many Americans, and it is getting worse every day. You've seen these challenges right here in the Boston area, with the outcry over the city canceling its late-night subway and bus service. Just see what happened with the MBTA last winter. People are craving better choices. That's the phrase Secretary Fox likes to use. So we actually imagined a city completely wired for connectivity with comprehensive data about where people want to go. How would you use this data to reimagine a transportation system that's more affordable, equitable, and efficient? Now, as a thought experiment, but we really believe that it will apply to cities. Our thought experiment had a number of outcomes. One was to show us the potential for integrated solutions to make a huge difference in urban life. So let's talk for a minute about the autonomous vehicle. I know many people here probably know a lot more than I do. One impact of the autonomous vehicle is that it will reduce the amount of space needed for parking in cities. That means more pedestrian paths and bike lanes, which means more active lifestyles, and we believe significant health savings over time, healthcare savings over time. It also means less opposition to dense development, which leads to a greater supply of housing, which helps to lower rents. By enticing more people back to the city, these shifts generate more revenue for services like transit systems, reducing, hopefully, commute times and expanding job opportunities. A second outcome of our analysis is that we've actually developed hypotheses about problems facing cities that we can test in the real world today. We've developed a new company called Flow. It's our transportation coordination platform. It's a great example of having an impact today that leads, we think, to this future that we see. Its hypothesis is simple but profound. Better data can help cities relieve traffic congestion and manage transit networks that frustrate commuters. We've actually developed Flow through conversations with local city agencies and through the DOT Smart City Challenge. Now the Flow team, in partnership with cities, is piloting tools that aggregate and analyze real-time data to provide applications that can help reduce congestion. So, what is our vision of what transportation could look like in the future? When you imagine a city from the internet up, you get a place that is personalized for our needs and desires, a place that is adaptable, constantly evolving with changing demands, technologies, and tastes, a place that is shareable in a million new ways, a place that feels like a city but functions like a community, a place that's more transparent, with more trust among neighbors and more faith in government. Now, I'm actually going to unpack these concepts in a minute, but first, let me be clear. When I say vision, I don't mean we have fully baked answers to all the urban mobility problems. I know how many barriers stand in the way, but we see these concepts as a reflection of the truly powerful changes taking place in the world of urban data, and as a starting point for a wider discussion of how technology might be applied to transportation challenges under the guidance of strong urbanist policy. So I said the first pillar is that transportation is becoming more personalized. By that, I don't mean more single occupancy driving, okay? We need less of that, not more. What I mean is something closer to what Secretary Fox describes as more mobility choices. Let's take parking as an example. One thing we have heard over and over and over again from cities was the difficulty they've had managing their parking networks. Poorly coordinated parking systems lead to unnecessary congestion as drivers circle blocks searching for space. They lead to higher rents because developers must build parking spots into new housing. And of course, they lead to tons of air pollution. We're now working with 2 big US cities to pilot new tools that could address these problems. Right now, for example, most navigation apps only tell you how to get from point A to point B. They don't include the extra time or cost it might take for you to find parking. Now imagine if you could type a destination into a navigation app and find, reserve, and pay for a parking spot before you leave the house. It's true, some people would use that type of app to drive right to the parking spot. At least that would mean no more circling for parking and less congestion and pollution. But others might conclude that ride-hail or public transportation is the cheaper or faster option and end up not driving at all. That means cleaner, more equitable cities. The result is a much more personalized mobility experience. But at the same time, this type of tool has benefits for the city at large, and I'll explain how. Imagine that all those private parking lots you pass downtown, at the church, the office building, the sports arena, were open to everyone at nearly all times. That's a powerful new way to utilize a city's assets. Aggregated, anonymized travel data can give us a pretty good idea on when those spots in the private garages or spaces are available and how many are left at a given time. Suddenly, it's possible to form a whole virtual or shared parking supply of previously hidden lots becoming much more accessible to a wider population. And now here's the payoff for the city. Since it's possible to find a spot nearby at all times, developers won't have to build as much parking, which again lowers the cost of housing and commercial spaces. Rents go down and it becomes cheaper to open a business. Local planners could eliminate parking requirements to encourage more mixed-use walkable development, further reducing car dependency. At their core, though, these outcomes give people better choices about how to get around. We also believe the future of transportation is in cities built from the internet up is also about adaptability. Here my example comes from public transit. When a fixed bus or rail route gets people where they need to go quickly, there is nothing better for a city. That's why I work so hard to extend the number 7 line in New York, the first real subway extension in 50 years. It literally opened up Manhattan's last frontier to extraordinary development. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not the reality. The average commuter can only reach 30% of metro area jobs within a 90-minute transit trip, according to a 2011 Brookings study. And it's getting worse. The result is fewer ways to connect people and job opportunities. So imagine again that you lived in a city completely wired for connectivity, where everybody had access with comprehensive data about where people want to go. How would you reimagine a transit system that adapted to the needs of the community? Well, one thing you would do is to use ubiquitous data to plan a better system. Right now, cities and transit agencies have to rely on transit demand models that we know aren't at all that accurate and that can't take into account the daily and seasonal fluctuations that we know shape travel patterns. But if you could collect the precise real-time data about where people were going in the city, whether through smartphones or some other means, and of course we can do this now, You could reconfigure a transit system based on a clearer picture of fluctuating travel demand. That doesn't mean cities would magically have the money to run buses everywhere. But you would know with much more certainty whether or not you were meeting the challenge of transport equity and be able to deploy bus service as efficiently as possible to meet local goals. The system could evolve much more efficiently with the city. But another thing you might do is explore better ways to extend the transit network, perhaps by partnering with more flexible, on-demand ride services. We know that cities often run empty buses to the far edge of their cities, which offers coverage, although inadequate, to all riders, but is very expensive to operate and often frustrating for the rider to rely on. We also know that in such situation, some cities already connect people with taxis through vouchers or paratransit services. Better data can help us figure out where it might make sense to supplement bus service with ride-hail options. We're seeing some of these experiments start to happen across the country. The most high-profile example is in Pinellas County, Florida, which has conducted a pilot to subsidize the cost of an Uber using money allocated for public transportation. It's not clear yet whether this experiment is working, but it's the type of adaptive system that ubiquitous data helps a city to explore. A third thing is better performance evaluation. Right now, our cities measure transit quality by how often a vehicle operates and how far you are from a bus stop. So if you're within a half mile of a bus stop where service runs every 15 minutes, that's considered a success. But that tells us nothing about whether or not you got to your destination on time or what percentage of jobs you can reach within a given time. Once again, clearer data about travel patterns could lead to enormous insights about how well cities are connecting residents to job opportunities and connecting businesses to the labor force, and how well they're adapting to changing populations. We expect that the future of transportation will also be even more highly shared. We're not the first to arrive at this conclusion. You here have all done that earlier. But it's a especially critical goal to work toward as we transition into an era of autonomous vehicles. We all know autonomous vehicles are coming. It's great that US DOT released its detailed set of policy guidelines. But while that helps tech firms, car companies, and states, we know that cities are going to be the ones on the front lines of this technological impact because we've actually seen this movie before. When the car replaced the horse-drawn buggy in the early part of the 20th century, it wasn't a sure thing that the technology would be as incredibly destructive to cities as we now know it was. Technology on its own doesn't have social impact. The policies we put in place around it are what matter. So without strong local guidelines, AVs could lead to an explosion of driving that hurts cities more than it helps them. But with strong, effective guidelines, AVs could lead to an explosion of shared rides that makes much better use of our roads and our vehicle capacities, all the while improving public safety. The critical moment is when AVs don't have any passengers in them. At that point, they just become mobile street furniture. These ghost rides could create enormous traffic, Imagine a world of people who don't want to pay for parking, so they set their car on auto cruise until they're done with work or an errand. How policymakers deal with this looming question and promote more sharing in our cities will go a long way toward making livable places and ensuring that the AV doesn't conquer the city the way the automobile did a century ago. We believe that transportation systems built from the internet up will be more communal, leading to a new network of streets built around pedestrians instead of cars. Now let's just stick with AVs for a moment. In a city filled with shared autonomous vehicles, we will need dramatically less land devoted to parking. So what can our cities do with that extra space? Well, for starters, imagine all of the ways you could radically reconceive street plans in a world filled of driverless, on-demand mobility. Instead of devoting curbs, surface lots, and garages to park cars, cities can redesign that space for people, homes, and pedestrian plazas. They can liven up the public realm and encourage the face-to-face interactions that make cities such powerful fountains of innovation. Converting parking spaces is just the beginning. Speed limits will be far more effective in shaping the feel of streets because AVs will follow the rules far more reliably. Fleets of shared AVs would mean far fewer vehicles could carry the same amount of people. Precise lane keeping means cities could eliminate the need for raised sidewalks and curbs. You ever seen pictures of cities from the late 1800s? They were filled with horses and people, the intermingling. We can begin to go back to that again. These advances will give cities the ability to redesign their street grid, not around the automobile, but around the needs of people. You could eliminate the wide, fast arterials designed entirely for car traffic that cause so many pedestrian deaths and slice neighborhoods in half. Instead, you can install district-type streets programmed with specific traffic restrictions, faster traffic on the perimeter of blocks, slower traffic in the center. The quality of life improvements from this type of change would be enormous. You could reclaim so much street space from cars that we believe over time everyone could live within a 10-minute walk of a park or public plaza. Vehicle collisions and injuries would be virtually eliminated. The convenience of walking or cycling would encourage many people to travel by these modes instead of by car. Overall cost of living would plummet because the extra open space could be devoted to new housing supply, lowering rents. And more mixed-use development would mean more people would live closer to their offices, so commutes would decline too. Overall, it's a path toward a much tighter community, a city that feels like a neighborhood. Now, the final pillar to our vision for the future of transportation is that it improves transparency and accountability, making the system fairer for all. We know, for instance, that there's a great degree of bias in the way traffic stops are conducted in cities. These stops disproportionately target minorities, and as we've seen all too often in the past couple of years, can lead to tragedy and injustice. Now imagine if we rebuilt our transportation system from the internet up, with sensors and license plate readers embedded in the infrastructure. Suddenly, cities can actually enforce traffic rules with objectivity. Suddenly, toll booths become entirely wireless, and the people manning them can be transitioned to more critical jobs like security. And if the constituency does empower local leaders to adapt a system like congestion pricing, and LPR, sensors and LPRs help ensure that those producing the bulk of the traffic pay their fair share for it, with the money potentially being transferred to other modes, like buses, as they do in London. Further down the line, when we enter a fully driverless world, the benefits become even greater. Because AVs will automatically follow the rules of the road, police officers once assigned to traffic will be freed up to do other things like develop better relationships with the communities that they patrol. Of course, as the environment becomes more instrumented, protecting privacy becomes more paramount. And as the rules become guiding forces behind our machines, they become even more important for policymakers to shape in a thoughtful way. Which brings me back to the point I mentioned toward the start. Reimagining transportation requires a larger role for policy in the future, not a smaller one. The technology will arrive, but its social impact will be agnostic. Just think back to the automobile of 1910. The car had arrived, but pedestrian and horses and trolleys still ruled the streets because policymakers had not yet created the rules that led to streets engineered for speed instead of safety. The same thing holds today. The effects a technology has on quality of life in our cities depends upon the regulatory framework in which it operates. That's why it is so important for urbanists and policymakers to learn to speak technology so they can anticipate potential impacts and recognize them far enough in advance to manage the transition. But their role is also to help technologists speak urbanism, to help entrepreneurs and startups appreciate that while many new technologies are urban in application, it's local government that can make sure they're actually good for cities. You here today, many of you have played a role in starting that conversation. With the Smart City Challenge, for example, and the new DOT guidelines for autonomous vehicles and the FTA Mobility Sandbox. But it's time to take these efforts further into our cities. It's time to set up guidelines for how services that use public streets, whether it's ride-hail services today or AVs tomorrow, share trip data with the city in ways that protect proprietary information, but also let planners do their jobs managing and planning our complex transportation system. We've actually started this effort in partnership with Transportation for America, gathering city agencies from across the US to share pilot outcomes and policy best practices when it comes to AVs, shared mobility, and data-driven performance metrics. But it's going to take an even greater push from all levels of government to prepare for the fourth urban technology revolution that's set to transform cities in ways we have not seen since Henry Ford. The future is not just for technologies to reimagine, because imagination on its own doesn't change the world. It's the policymakers who can bring these ideas from the digital cloud to the actual curb that will determine what shape our future cities ultimately take. Thank you, and be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
You talked couple times about sort of secondary or induced benefits for cyclists. I'm curious if you see any direct benefits from the technology on the cycling mode.
Well, I think absolutely. As I mentioned, I think that, look, we are in cities, and I happen to actually be an owner of a company called Motivate, which manages and owns bike share systems, including Hubway here and City Bike in New York. And we're already beginning to see sort of what I call the virtuous cycle of biking beginning to really operate in our cities. What I mean by the virtuous cycle of biking is the more people who bike, the more cities respond by providing better biking infrastructure. When there are that better infrastructure that draws more people into biking, which by the way creates a greater sense of safety, but also a constituency for more investment in biking infrastructure. Now, that has been, for example, dramatically enhanced with bike share, as we see more and more people biking in our cities as a result of bike share, which makes it easier because you don't have to worry about bringing your bike or having your bike stolen. Bike share itself is the product of technology, okay, shared services, a lot of the factors that are driving, for example, the ride share services are also to some extent driving bike share. That's an early example, but as a lot of these trends that I have actually described are coming, I think that will only accelerate the advance of additional sort of infrastructure, making bike share easier. You know, it's interesting, in New York yesterday with I'm not sure this is public or not, but with City Bike, we had 70,000 rides in New York City yesterday. It was all-time record in October, the end of October. Now, it was a nice day. But, you know, the subway system, rather taxis in New York, I think, take on average 400,000 people a day. So it is, I think we're in this virtuous cycle now, and it's only going to accelerate as we move forward. And when we begin to really, as a result of autonomous shared vehicles, reclaim space in cities, you'll see that infrastructure, I think, dramatically improve. Yes, sir.
So I have a question from the webinar.
Okay.
Who will own all this data? Will it be in Sidewalk Labs servers without access to public agencies? How can other agencies and researchers get access to the data? What data sharing and governance models we put into place to ensure data sharing?
That is a fabulous question. I assume everybody could hear the question on the webinar as well. It's basically, who owns this data? And I think it's a great question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet. And it's going to be negotiated by companies with cities as we move forward. You know, it's very interesting. One of the things Sidewalk Labs is doing right now, believe it or not, there are 7,000 payphones in New York City right now. A payphone. Nobody uses payphones anymore. But there's 7,000. We, through a company that we formed called Intersection, are replacing all of those payphones with these really, really powerful data and communication hubs that first and foremost offer free, high-speed, literally 1 gigabit Wi-Fi on the streets of New York. And it'll be in all 5 boroughs and basically every neighborhood. We pay for it with a fairly clever advertising model. And so we have worked with the city to define not only the privacy policy, but also the data sharing policies. And there were no real guides for us when we did that with the city. There are no real standards for data privacy in public spaces, or actually for the use of that data. And we've certainly seen that battle play out with Uber in cities across the country. So we're now in a very formative period, and I'll be honest, I don't yet know the answers. I do know that we are going to have to wrestle with these issues in the coming years, but I can't tell you exactly what the outcome is going to be. Yes, sir.
You talked about shared parking. Has that taken off in any cities how would you see it taking off? What do you see as the key ingredient to getting that going? Because there's so much opportunity there, it seems.
I think shared parking is a massive opportunity. What we are beginning to see is city planning departments meaningfully lower parking requirements for development in communities, recognizing that there is generally somewhat less need for cars, and that will happen. But in terms of shared parking, the way it'll eventually happen is all the lots will essentially become part of a network. They will then decide how much they want to allow their lots to be used based on data as to how they're used, normally. So for example, the stadium on game day is going to allow 0, but on a non-game day, they'll allow 100%. And then as you integrate all of that data, it will then be integrated with the kind of parking application that I described earlier, and then it'll be a much more efficient matching of space. Said you'll be able eventually to reserve space, you'll be able to pay for it, and then over time the system will learn from usage patterns and will refine itself, giving it better information to the parking lot owner, which by the way can include the city. The city is the largest owner of parking spaces within its borders, as well as consumers. So it's a very good example again of what we think will be really dramatically better use of space in cities. As we talk about this technology revolution that we are in cities, that we are just in the early innings of embarking on, that's forged by ubiquitous connectivity and sensors broadly defined, social networks, and advanced computing power. That's one of the single biggest things that will come out of it, even more dramatic, anything that we've seen before, is greater sharing. And this is a perfect example of it. Yes, sir.
How do you see small to mid-sized cities and towns adapting to this? I just imagine, with our 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, they can't even agree to use the same parking app or the same bike share system. As all this stuff rolls out, do you see a way forward to coordinate that?
I think coordinating it from above is really hard, right? Unless the state is ever prepared to use its actually extraordinary powers over cities and towns, which rarely it is, that's unlikely. Instead, I think hopefully what you'll begin to see is a convergence of the most effective systems out there, but always adapted to particular local conditions. It's hard to force. I said in Massachusetts, there's 350 cities and towns, and nobody tells them really what to do other than in rare circumstances. So instead, I think it has to work from the product up rather than the mandate down. Some things, by the way, where there are shared assets like roadways, where the state has enormous control over the roadways, at least the ones outside and connecting through cities, there you can see dramatically more. And of course, there is a role for the federal government in that as well. But we really haven't begun discussing that yet. For now, it's just about getting systems out there. We're starting on our parking thing with 2 cities. Hopefully what will happen is cities will see that what we're trying to do makes sense and they will copy. One thing that does happen, I will tell you, is cities increasingly are really sophisticated, desperate to find solutions for their citizens, generally are reasonably empowered, and are often very eager just to copy best practices from other cities. I saw this when I was deputy mayor. I don't know how many of you have been to New York and actually walked on the High Line. I don't know how many of you have done that, but the High Line was an abandoned freight line that was ready to be torn down when the Bloomberg administration came into office, and we decided to preserve it. And it has actually turned it into a park. And it has become the most successful new park, arguably anywhere in the world for the last several decades. I think something like 7.5 million people walked on it last year. But once we opened it up, within a year, there were 36 high lines under development around the world. So same thing, by the way, happened with bike share. You know, it started in Paris, and today there's 800 systems around the world. Everyone may not be the same, but there will ultimately be a convergence around the best systems. It just takes time. All of this, by the way, I want to point out when I talk about a fourth urban technology revolution, all of this takes a ton of time. Right? If you think about the 3 previous technology revolutions, the first one really created by the steam engine, which made it possible through railroads to get people and goods to cities more easily, made it possible to industrialize cities, in some ways enabled modern sanitation. And then the electric grid, which made cities vertical, lit them up so they could be 24 hours and made it easier to get around in. And then the automobile, which we talked about. Each one of those to get fully integrated into the physical environment actually took more than a generation. So this stuff doesn't happen fast, but we think it will happen. Yes, sir.
What do you see happening to emergency vehicles, construction vehicles, trash trucks, delivery trucks? All those things are still going to be today are pretty big still. When roads get smaller and disappear.
Well, first of all, I don't think the roads are going to disappear. I think the road networks will change fairly dramatically. There will probably always be a need for, there obviously will be a need for specialty vehicles, and those will have to be accommodated in the road network. If you think about freight, I think the system of freight in cities is going to change radically. You're going to have autonomous freight delivery. You'll probably have warehouses that take deliveries in, get broken down, and move into, then get distributed through smaller vehicles, autonomous vehicles in cities. Vehicles, emergency vehicles, are still going to have to be accommodated. They will never be, in my view, autonomous completely. There's always going to have to be people that's servicing them in them. There'll be rare specialty vehicles that just won't adapt. But the rules of the road will be much clearer. The rest of the vehicles will be traveling at lower speeds. Instead, absent emergencies, I think what you'll see is greater adherence overall, and therefore, won't undermine sort of the safety of the environment that we foresee. But there obviously will have to be adjustments based on very unique circumstances. Yes, sir.
What role do you see for the regional multimodal planners? If you look out the window, you see the red line going from Cambridge to Boston, and when we take that, it continues on through, in the region, 80 cities and towns. We don't usually pay attention to city boundaries. It's a regional system. The metropolitan planning organizations, there are 400 of them around the country. Yep. They have a federal role. They do the long-range planning, but most of your focus is policy, which makes sense, but it's been urban, and I think you mentioned...
That's only because my focus is more urban, but look, every city is part of a metropolitan area. Every metropolitan area is part of a national network, and the kinds of coordination that take place today, the kind of planning that take place today is still going to be required. It's just going to be with a separate set of tools and with a separate set of problems. So no, I said my focus happens to be on cities, but that does not in any way undermine the importance of regional and national planning. Regional planning is hard. When I was deputy mayor, I developed what I immodestly called Doctoroff's theorem. And that was to calculate the degree of difficulty in getting anything done in government. My theorem was the degree of difficulty is x plus 3y plus 6z plus infinity. So x was the number of city agencies, y was the number of state agencies, z was the number of federal agencies, and infinity was if the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was involved. I developed this theory, by the way, in the process of the work that we did to redevelop the Ground Zero or the World Trade Center site. And look, it's not because people typically are exercising bad faith. It's everybody has their own agendas, and coordinating those agendas is very difficult, both from a time and a money perspective, let alone politics. And so just the more people are involved, the more complicated it is, the farther away they are, the more difficult it is. And then occasionally there's the actor who's just impossible. So but there's always, look, there is a desperate need. In New York now, there's a lot of regional planning going on. And actually, I think finally, as we beginning to develop, some greater sense of coherence, but it's not easy. Yes, sir, in the back.
Because this technology is so new and we're just beginning to understand the implications of what it can do, and you mentioned the importance of developing an effective policy framework. What do you think is probably the most important thing, or some of the most important things for us to consider so this technology doesn't escape our means of implementing it?
As I said, I think the first thing you have to consider is what are your goals, right? If, for example, our goal is to reduce vehicle miles traveled, that implies one set of policy solutions. If our goal is to get people to where they want to go more equitably and less expensively, that may imply another set of policy goals. And determining what those policy goals is a public conversation that actually needs to happen. And really all I'm saying now is I don't know what the answers are. We certainly have a bit of a vision for where things may be going in cities, and is to really encourage that discussion to happen sooner rather than later, because the discussion is going to be a difficult one. There are going to be many differing opinions. There's going to be a lot of money and political influence on all sides of these questions. And if we don't start now, the one thing we know will happen is it will be like 1910 all over again.